I had this scrapbook that I felt in the Dimaggio's last year or two, and I was going to keep an accounting of everything he did. And then into the picture came this beautiful blonde lady. And I fell in love with her, and I started to keep in a scrapbook, the back of the scrapbook of Marilyn Monroe. And
this is before they had a relationship?
This is before they ever knew each other.
Wow, what a coincidence.
And the scrapbook came, and until the scrapbook got...
On some subliminal level, you might have brought them together with the scrapbook.
Maybe I did. Maybe I did, but... And my mother used to always be looking at the scrapbook that I kept, and I wouldn't let nobody touch it. In fact, when my mother passed away a few years ago, my sister brought the scrapbook back to me. And when the pictures got together, and you could put no more pictures in it, somewhere in that area, Dimaggio and her met, and later on got married. So when I first started that scrapbook, they were as far away as two people could be from being with each other. And by the end, when that scrapbook was filled, they met each other. So, like Eddie says, I may have had something to do with that.
Kismet.
She really overflowed with a lot of sexuality. I mean, physically, it was there. It was very powerful. But the sweetness of the girl and the genuineness and the refreshing quality she had became endearing to people. I mean, the truck drivers, simple workers, guys, they all fell in love with this girl.
In a sense, they were both the same way. Marilyn Monroe says, apparently this guy is the most glamorous baseball player in the world. Dimaggio knows who she is. Maybe I could say he felt that was a feather in his cap.
We figured Dimaggio was in a perfect mix, the greatest woman in the world and the greatest guy in the world. Joe was striking in himself, and of course Marilyn was the it woman of the world in those days. It was a perfect match.
At the time, 1952, it did seem perfect. Joe and Marilyn, Mr. and Mrs. America. How could they go wrong? We fell in love with the idea, as did Joe that very first night, when her publicist arranged a blind date dinner. In his silence at the table, Marilyn saw solid strength. He was so different from all the Hollywood chatterers. She offered him a ride home and asked in the car why he'd come out to meet her. Surely he'd met so many famous people. Said Joe, "But you're prettier than Douglas MacArthur." Joe never did get home that night.
They were great. They were laughing, you know, a lot of time, telling stories. Joe was telling stories about when we were kids, you know, what we did and all that, and she would get a big bang out of it. And I think that Joe and Marilyn were, in a roundabout way, well meant for each other.
They had one big thing in common. Each was an enormous figure created by the hero machine. And inside that vast personage lived a small person, fearful to be seen. In their loneliness, they might have been brother and sister. Joe insisted they be husband and wife. When they got married in January 1954, Marilyn told reporters she was going to be a perfect wife. She'd iron his shirts and make dinner. They were going to make a room in their house for Joe Jr. and a nursery. Marilyn said she wanted 6 kids. Of course, she also said she wasn't giving up the movie business.
When a well-known honeymoon couple arrives at Tokyo Airport, a throng of 4,000 baseball and movie fans surge out of control, break through police lines. Joe Dimaggio and his bride smile bravely at their greeters, but they don't dare move. But their troubles aren't over. Next day comes a press conference where the public was barred, but the photographers and reporters more than made up for that. Their questions were rough, ranging from the risque to the ridiculous, and Joe, He's the forgotten man, which is something in Japan where baseball is so popular. I mean, never underestimate the power of you-know-who. But enough's enough. His patience is exhausted, and Joe says, go.
While they were in Japan, the United States government, the Army, asked Marilyn to come to Korea to entertain the troops and to sing a few songs for them. She did that. She left Dimaggio. It was their honeymoon. He wasn't too happy about that.
Marilyn had never worked a live audience, but when those soldiers started going nuts, for the first time in her career, she said, she felt at home. And she said, I'll always remember my honeymoon in Korea with the 45th Division.
When she came back to Japan, she said to Joe, she was so thrilled by the crowd, and she said to Joe, there were 100,000 soldiers out there. You never heard such cheering. And Joe said, yes, I have. I think Joe Dimaggio never really understood Marilyn's insecurity and what she needed in her own life.
Neither could Marilyn understand Joe's fears. It wasn't long before she was back at work, long hours at the studio. Joe was home, staring at his TV, sure he was losing her. He couldn't let that happen.
She told me, she says, Joe is absolutely obsessed with jealousy about me. He thinks that I've had affairs with every man I've ever known in the industry. He doesn't trust me. He doesn't want me out of his sight. He wants me to give up my career altogether. I don't know what to do.
For the 7-year itch, she flew cross-country to film exteriors in New York. All Joe could do was follow. Then he watched in horror as his wife made a spectacle of herself. Photographers were lying on the tar of Lexington Avenue with their lenses pointed right up at her crotch. Marilyn and Joe had a screaming fight, and he left town. When she got back to California, they fought again. This time it was physical. Next day, the studio sent its minions to stage manage her exit.
Miss Monroe will have nothing to say this morning.
She told friends Joe had beaten her, but she added, not without cause. She told a California court that Joe had tortured her with mental cruelty. She wanted divorce. Joe thought he could stop her if he could just make her see how sorry he was.
I meet Frank Sinatra and Jimmy Van Heusen for dinner at the Villa Capri restaurant. In walks Joe. Frank got me over there because he knew that Marilyn and I were good friends, and perhaps I could get to Marilyn and maybe get Joe to talk to her. I called the studio. She said to me, Brad, I don't want to talk to him. I've had it, and this is it. He had tears in his eyes. He was crestfallen, he had tears, and he was miserably unhappy.
The marriage had lasted 274 days. Joe went back to San Francisco with his 2 suitcases, his golf clubs, and his shame. And it would only get worse.
Mr. Miller, Miss Monroe, yesterday you didn't know when you were going to get married. Do you know today?
In 1956, the New York playwright Arthur Miller announced that he would marry Marilyn. And she said Miller was the only man she'd ever truly loved. Friends told Joe he had to pick himself up, move on, forget her. Joe forgot them instead. For the next 5 years, he tried to forget himself. He traveled, he drank, he dated not well, but with athletic vigor. Movie stars, debutantes, beauty queens, and always voluptuous blondes. an actress who won a Marilyn look-alike contest, a Miss America whose talent was impersonating Marilyn, and a Miami Beach artiste, the Marilyn Monroe of burlesque. The real Marilyn's marriage to Arthur Miller had broken up. She was anxious, depressed. She checked herself into a Manhattan psych ward, and now they wouldn't let her go. She was trapped, terrified, and she called Joe Dimaggio. Joe was there next day, fierce, proprietary, as if he and Marilyn had never split up. "You release my wife," Dimaggio growled at the front desk, "or I'll take this place apart piece of wood by piece of wood." Suddenly they discovered Miss Monroe was all ready to go.
The only time that I saw them together outside of spring training was I was doing shows in New York, and I was walking down Park Avenue to get to my car. And I saw this couple coming down, and Joe's got his head up in the air and his arm around Marilyn, and they're just daydreaming along, never even saw me. So I didn't bother to stop and say hello. I thought he was happy as he was. Leave him alone.
Mr. President, Marilyn Monroe.
It was when they weren't together that Joe worried. The minute she went back to work, she fell in with Sinatra's posse. They knew how to have fun. And the Kennedys, sure, Joe knew about that. More than he wanted to know. It was like he couldn't turn away. How could he save her from herself?
She was a very, very unhappy girl. She felt that she had come to the end of the road, you see, and she was drinking heavily, and she was also taking upper and downer drugs. She was lost.
Marilyn didn't know what she wanted. Joe helped her get a house back in Hollywood. She'd promised to stay off the booze and pills. She'd talk about getting back together. They'd have another chance. Joe talked to friends like it was all settled. They were getting married again. When Marilyn died of a drug overdose, no one came to the house but doctors and lawyers, and they didn't know what to do. So they called Joe Dimaggio, and he walled away all the Hollywood players, producers, directors, acting stars, studio chiefs, and the public. How much more did he owe them? The fame had eaten up his life, and now it took from him the one person who might have understood. The way Joe said it, they'd killed his girl. So in the chapel, safe for the moment from prying eyes, alone and embittered, Joe kissed Marilyn goodbye.
Frank says, you know, Joe hates Hollywood and hates everybody in the picture business, and hates anybody who had anything to do with Marilyn or even said hello to her. But I firmly believe that all the years that he made those visitations to her gravesite and left flowers was out. He was still in love with her, but also out of a great sense of guilt. Because I think he helped contribute to her demise. I'm firmly convinced that if he had behaved differently, they would have had a good marriage. He destroyed it, and he felt that guilt.
Never mention her, never. No matter what, he would never say anything about it, and we dare not say anything to him about it. You know, because that was something that wasn't easy to, I guess, to just let go.